welcome to the latest episode of The X Factor. And yes, when we talk about private equity and performance, people in our audience and the kind of DNA that you all possess to pull off Mission Impossible. So with that in mind, we're excited to be joined today by Lindsay Gazowski, who is the founder and CEO of the Crucible. And the Crucible is the first and only behavioral assessment and research tool of its kind that was built for the express purpose of helping executives and private equity sponsors understand fit, performance upside, and opportunities for coaching and development. So Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So part of what we want to do is kind of demystify this crazy world of assessments. I think all of us have been subjected to them one way or another, either at a company offsite retreat or through an interview process of our own. But just kind of take us through the high level view of the world of assessments as you see it.
Yeah, so assessments can take a lot of different forms, and they're everything from, people taking quizzes online to learn a little bit about themselves, all the way up through extensive multi-hour in-person and written, almost quasi-interviews with behavioral specialists to understand exactly how you tick. The majority of the assessments that are used in hiring and development purposes tend to try to focus on certain behavioral traits and to understand how those fit together to make someone effective, what kind of risks they bring to the table, and really to understand whether or not this person is going to be able to do the things the rest of the team needs them to do. A lot of assessments can be used for individuals to make themselves better, but most of the time when we encounter them, we're seeing these assessments because someone else is asking us to take them in an effort to learn about us, less so than to learn about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and without sounding too cynical, the general executive attitude toward assessments that I've encountered when we conduct executive searches is sort of neutral to negative, but not necessarily a lot of representation on the positive side. So I'll hear a typical comment like, well, I don't really want to take your assessment or your client's assessment because if they can't tell who I am from the interview process, then I don't want to work there anyway. Now, I've got my own opinion on that attitude and how it's not necessarily constructive to a good search outcome. But I think where a majority of executives land is, okay, I took it. What did your client think? And how is it going to manifest in the rest of the interview process? So when an executive takes an assessment as part of a C-suite search process, what is that client doing with that information behind the scenes? And how can the executives kind of think about that as the process unfolds?
Sure. To your point of negative perception, I had a client refer to even our assessment as an executive torture toy, which I think gives a good sense of how people actually think about these things, because ours is reasonably easy in the grand scheme of what assessments look like. But there are a lot of assessments out there. And when private equity funds and hiring managers are looking at these assessments, they're trying to do a couple things. First, they're looking at the data to see if there are any red flags. A lot of people have red flags that might be specific to that investment, that fund, an orientation that won't work well for this specific job. And then there are other red flags out there, which I think we've all encountered. Someone who might be entirely too arrogant, or someone who exhibits, an inability to change, where those flags, if they come up, may just be an issue for any environment where this person's going to be. And some of those things you can see in interviews, but a lot of it doesn't come out until you get a level deeper, especially for those people that are good at interviewing or are good at selling themselves and their story because they've done it a number of times. So the first thing they're looking for are those red flags. The second piece that I think that funds and hiring managers want to see is, does this provide insurance, or does this back up thoughts we already have? And so it provides, much like a lot of consulting type reports and diligence results, just some additional numbers, paperwork, et cetera, to say, yep, we did what we needed to do to say that this person is who we thought they were. And the final thing is to see if there are any developmental opportunities or any strengths that they can leverage. That last piece is only utilized by the best of funds and companies. For the most part, it's either red flags or people are thinking through, how they can sort of cover themselves in the process to say that they did what they needed to do and check the box.
Yeah, that syncs with what we've seen in the market. There's a few different consumers of these reports on the private equity side, one of them being a head of human capital or organizational development, if that role exists at a fund.
Right.
Those folks, for our audience's benefit, are typically trained, certified, and quite facile at whatever assessment tool that they're using. And they tend to be dogmatic about using the same assessment on every search. So they've got the body of work from which to look at individual results. And I think for our members out there, yeah, if your test results indicate some sort of flag, you may not find yourself progressing very far in the process from there, because those things can spook some of our private equity clients out there. For the contextual concerns, is this individual generally good, but how will they perform in this investment? That's where the more savvy users of the report will kind of probe and identify opportunities to develop during the interview process. So I don't know, I guess I'm interested in your opinion, but what I would say to executives is, pay attention to how the interview is going. Be aware of what are they really trying to get at. And if you sense that they're digging for something, be highly cooperative and help them get to the bottom of it versus trying to be evasive. Because if who you really are isn't going to work well in that opportunity, I promise you don't want to be there.
That's exactly right. I think that the piece of it that's most illustrative for me when I'm walking executives through assessments, and I founded Crucible, but I'm certified in a whole host of these, is that there's something about themselves that will set them up for success in certain environments and be far less successful in others. And so for everyone in their career and in life, you should be looking to maximize your ability to succeed. So putting yourself in an environment that is misaligned with who you are and being intellectually dishonest in an interview process because you're trying to win the job as opposed to trying to find a great match just isn't going to work out well in the long run, regardless.
Yeah, so that sort of reminds me, as a quick shout out to our audience, if you are asked to take one of these assessments, and I think Lindsay would agree with me on this, please do not try to game the results by answering in a manner that is either aspirational, untrue, or what you perceive the right answer to be that the client might be searching for. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Lindsay.
Yeah, and most of the statistically valid assessments out there actually have measures in them that will trip if you're doing too much of that anyway. It's a challenge, and then you hit a different type of red flag in the process, which is considerably worse. Because it's one thing to be slightly misaligned with a fund or need other support mechanisms or other behavioral traits in the organization to bolster who you are and what's going to be most successful. It's a totally separate thing if someone thinks you're lying or trying to game things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just not tenable in these environments.
Yeah, that's where you get a call from the recruiter the day after taking the assessment, and you're told that the search is going in a different direction, or some generic statement leaves you with little to no feedback. So I think don't savvy sponsors also reference these results during the diligence process right before offer when they're conducting reference calls?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly should be. Some sponsors are sensitive to the fact that they don't want a company taking a number of these tests because they're going to stick with that management team for a period of time and evaluate them in the seat, and they want to get a deal done because they want to be seen as less hands-on, they almost always end up replacing those people anyway. And so our advice is always, regardless of what assessment you used, you should be doing human capital diligence on management teams before you buy. But to your point, the more savvy investors are, and they're going in and they're figuring out, what do we have here? What do we get to build? What can we leverage? How great are these people? And it's not always oh God, okay, everyone's terrible, let's replace them. For the most part, they're looking to see, how little do we have to replace? And how can we best utilize the institutional knowledge that's going to come with these people, with the leadership skills that are here?
Yeah, and we'll circle back on this next point a little later in the conversation, but we also see some use cases where pretty serious executives are really looking to calibrate themselves at all times based on behavioral standards of excellence. And so they'll sign up for and take these assessments on their own. And then we also see situations where existing teams will want to get more insight into the way each other is wired, and they'll put their teams through these assessments and use it as a developmental exercise to better understand each other. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. What do you see as the limitations of assessments as we know them?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that, to your first point on people assessing themselves, a lot of these assessments are built for the general population. I took some of these same assessments when I was 22 out of college that people are taking as senior executives. If you're assessing people at all levels of an organization with the exact same test and with the same base algorithms behind it, assuming there is a base algorithm behind it, it's going to be too general. Most executives should do well, or those behavioral traits aren't well calibrated to what someone needs in that executive leadership. The second piece of it, and this is part of why we went to develop the Crucible in the first place, is that for given environments, there are wildly different skills and talents that are needed. If you have someone that you're looking for to run a Fortune 500 company or a Fortune 100 company, that is a different role and a different set of skills than if you're getting someone to run, a $100 million high growth roll up entity that needs a lot of really hands-on engagement, someone who can have shareholder buy-in, someone who can work with these funds. And each fund is different. So having that ability to really find an assessment that is specific to what you're looking to get out of it is important. The other piece, and this should go without saying, but a lot of people use assessments that aren't statistically valid for the environment that they're looking for. The Myers-Briggs test isn't a particularly good one, has some unique insights, has a lot of, test retest consistency. There are things there. It's not necessarily going to tell you what you want to see, because it can be gamed, and because it is easy to see, someone who wants to think of themselves as extroverted to pick all the extroverted scales, things of that nature. There are other tests that even explicitly state that they should be given in person and are usually sent over the internet. That's a challenge, because if you're not using it in the context that they're supposed to be created, it means that the results may not be as accurate as you'd hope.
Well, I think one of the reasons that fuels some of the skepticism out there is that, it's a pretty sizable industry. Private equity sponsors to a fund use some tool on nearly 100% of their searches. And yet in the aggregate, there's roughly 50% turnover at the C-suite in these PE-backed portfolio companies. So something must be amiss. And I guess I'm going to throw you a softball here and say that must have been what helped lead you to want to create the Crucible explicitly for private equity.
Yeah, so my background, for those who don't want to go look up my LinkedIn, I had academic training in quantitative sociology, and then worked in private equity on the deal side briefly, and then worked in executive search for a number of years, and saw that a lot of these assessments were, as noted, too general, not calibrated to the fund and the specifics that are needed there, and weren't assessing things that were important to private equity. There's a critical sense of urgency because you have to get things done in 4 years. There is a sense where you have to be execution driven, and you have to be good at leveraging various emotions of yourself and others in a private equity backed environment that may not be as necessary when you have the structure of a larger organization. Or there might be skills like some interpersonal politics that might be more important if you're working for a family environment that may not necessarily be quite as relevant in a PE environment that is focused on eventually the outcomes, building a great company along the way, but you're trying to get to exit. And so we wanted to create an assessment that could test for all these behavioral traits, understand where people were likely to struggle in periods of extreme stress, if any, and to be able to configure those assessments on the individual level to the funds so that we can learn from what does success look like for fund A that might be very hands-on, execution driven, versus fund B that's consistently buying from founders that they keep in the business and need a different approach to engagement and how things get done. We wanted to make sure all of that could happen on the individual level so that funds could also then track this information over time, have an algorithm that self-updates through machine learning and AI, and figure out how to find better people that are better fits for the fund and for those investments, not just decent executives overall. And then we also want to do that on the group level, which when you talk about limitations, that's the other major set of limitations, is that most executives are tested in a vacuum. They're given an assessment and it says, great, this person is a B+. Okay. Well, maybe they have a number of skills that would round out a team. So maybe in isolation, they're good, not great. But in the context of this team, they're absolutely the linchpin. If you think about a professional basketball team, it doesn't work when you have too many superstars there that are not playing well together. Everyone has a role to play, and being able to put people together in a structure that can enable those people to all be better and learn from one another and leverage those skills while having enough consistency amongst the team to operate in the same way. That's another critical aspect of building a great team. And most of these assessments can't do that.
Yeah, sounds good. So let's break down some of the unique aspects of the Crucible. And I'm familiar with it. So full disclosure, I was an advisor with Lindsay when she got this started. So I've kind of seen it built from the ground up. And then real world, I have several executive search clients of Falcon on the private equity side who have come to use Crucible as their go-to assessment tool. So I've seen it play out in the executive search process. And I think recruiters, another topic for a different day, also have a cynical view about assessments because they don't want anything to protract the search or to cause it to take longer to get completed. We view the Crucible as a welcome addition to our process because we'd much rather get it right, even if that means passing over an otherwise solid appearing candidate, taking a little bit longer on the search to get the right outcome for our clients. But when I see our clients really lean into the Crucible and get excited about the results, I guess there's 3 areas that come to mind. The first one is you've done a great job of creating a quantified score. So usually you only see a score, a percentile score on maybe a strict cognitive assessment. It's rare to see something like that on a behavioral assessment. So tell us about the private equity quotient.
Okay, so because we wanted this specific to private equity, we came up with, after testing literally thousands of private equity executives, came up with an algorithm that can score people relative to, are they likely to be successful in private equity? And that again doesn't mean are they likely to be successful as a person or are they likely to be successful in another environment. This is for private equity. Can they be successful? And so our algorithm spits out a number, which is a percentile score. So, it's an average person is going to get a 50. Most of our clients want people who are above average. It's, everyone's sort of like woebegone that the entire industry finds their people to be above average, but that can be true if we can configure it for each fund because it's slightly different. But we see this private equity quotient that takes into account elements and catalysts. And we went pretty far with Crucible with the metalworking, theming here. So there are 5 catalysts that we're looking across, and that's leadership, execution, interpersonal skills, emotional leverage, and cognitive ability. And we do put a cognitive piece in there because, as studies have shown in the past, the only thing that had been proven previously to indicate success in these companies to a statistically significant level was, are people more cognitively capable? And that's across things like pattern recognition and logic. It's not just pure IQ. And so we look at those different catalysts, and then each one is made up of sub-elements. So, under execution, it's things like, are people hands-on? Are they detail-oriented? Under emotional leverage, do they have a sense of urgency, passion, drive? These components are all critical for private equity and get combined up to highlight a private equity quotient score. And then each individual catalyst and element have their own percentile scores. So someone can see across these items, their systems and metrics orientations are in the 93rd percentile, but their detail orientation is only in the 40th. What does that mean for someone? And how can they improve on the piece that may not be there? So that's one of the other fundamental beliefs that we have, is that everyone has the opportunity to work on things that they're not good at. These aren't static scores. They're things that people can lean into and improve those over time or bolster with other members of their team. If you're great at systems but not great at the detail, create your system so it highlights the anomalies in the details. Make sure you're reviewing them.
Yeah, it's clear to me when our private equity clients or portfolio company CEOs, if it's a other C-suite role, get a very warm and fuzzy feeling when they see the 5 catalysts, because they can instantly recognize that their hiring wins and hiring mistakes have either scored well or poorly across those 5. And just to hit them again, execution. For those of you in private equity, you know what that's about. For those of you aspiring to get into it, you'll find out. I'll just call it durability, which the test calls emotional leverage, but it's your ability to survive and withstand and perform well within the pressurized environment of PE. Leadership, really rooted in accountability and results.
Yep.
Interpersonal piece is huge, because it's not just, are you a nice person, but can you get along with people? Or will you start to grate on the private equity sponsor and your fellow C-suite colleagues over time? No matter how talented you are, they're not going to want to endure that. And then, as you rightly mentioned, the cognitive piece, because all things equal, we'd rather have a slightly brighter bulb if we can find it. So that's interesting. And when I've seen clients utilize it, they kind of look at the overall score, they look at some of those catalyst results, and then they'll also look at the interplay of some of the elemental scores. For example, and you've helped us understand this, but sense of urgency is ideally going to be a high score. But if it's paired with a low score on impatience, well, you might have an issue there. You could have somebody who they themselves are getting everything they can done as quickly as possible, but are way too patient with those around them holding up their end of the bargain. All of a sudden, you may have an individual who's urgent, but an organization and or team that's less so. Another one that we've seen is, if you're really big into belief in others, you really believe that people can conquer the world. You have very high empathy scores. Okay, fine. In a vacuum, those two are potentially okay. But what if they're paired with a very low score on driving accountability?
Right.
Well, all of a sudden you've got a real issue. And those are just two examples of dozens, if not hundreds, of ways to dissect the assessment for next level insight.
Yeah, I think there are a number of people out there who, especially when trained in much larger environments, actually do really, really well on certain aspects of behavioral testing. And then you get into the interplay between these things and you discover that they need structures around them, or they'll push themselves to move forward, but will not be able to get two levels down anyone else involved. Or they like to behave in silos where, they may be the world's greatest CFO for finance and accounting measures, but don't go outside of that to consult on how to help sales do what they need to do in a more productive way. There's a lot of those elements that when you look at the interplay between different behavioral criteria, it really gets at that. My favorite combination of elements that we have in the assessment is we have both a competitiveness measure and a disdain for losing. And disdain for losing is basically refusing to accept defeat. You're going to make sure that the business does something. It's not going to fail at its critical measures. Will it get a 4x return? Maybe not, but you're going to ensure at least it gets at least 2x. Competitiveness is a totally different concept in so far as it's more about the desire to win and the desire to be out there and competing. People are very competitive, also lose a lot. You sometimes get the home run hitters that knock it out of the park, but also will strike out a whole bunch because they're going to go after every single pitch. Well, if one of those is high, if your competitiveness is really high, but your disdain for losing is low, that could be a real risk for an organization. If the disdain for losing is really high, but your competitiveness is low, at times you might be a more moderated results kind of person or leader. And having that combination there and being able to understand how those play together can be really fun, especially when you're working through this in the context of a larger team.
Well, don't even get me started on competitiveness. That's one of my interviewing pet peeves when we're conducting searches. And I will often ask a question to try to get at competitiveness. And the examples are invariably, well, I refuse to let my daughter win at ping pong. Okay, that's fine in the moment. You want to dominate your child, but what are you doing behind the scenes to sacrifice and ensure that you're doing everything possible to win? But that's a different topic for a different day. Okay, so we've covered off on the first kind of unique dimension in my mind of the Crucible, which is the 5 catalysts and how they are scored and inform a broader PEQ score for quantitative results. So that's great. The second thing that I see clients really getting comfort in is the representation of what the Crucible calls an archetype.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just set this up as a lay person user of it, and then Lindsay can give us some of the science behind it. But there's basically a 2-dimensional axis, and you've got on from the bottom to the top, let's say. And by the way, bottom to top is not better or worse. It's just the way that it's laid out.
Right.
We've got the sort of speed of decision making. How long does it take once you do all the analytics to then trust your gut instinct and experience and put that analysis into action? Some people like to measure 10 times and not cut at all. Other people may not even measure once, and then they get their saw going. So that's sort of the one axis. The other is how much of a catalyst are they, sorry to use that word, how much of an activator are they of transformation? So on the right-hand side, you're going to be much more inclined to be dissatisfied with the status quo and have real borderline anxiety about remaking the organization into a better version of itself. Toward the left side of that axis, you're going to be more content with riding along with whatever may be in place. So you think about that axis and you've got, okay, this person loves to transform and they make pretty speedy decisions. Feels pretty good for private equity. If you're in a different region, it may not necessarily be a non-starter, but it does represent some potential implications. But tell us more about how you like to use the archetypes.
Sure. And so one of the pieces with the transformation bias is that, it goes from actors, as Rob said, those are people that are a lot more content with whatever's sort of given to them. They might knock it out of the park, whatever that is. So if you're given a task as an actor, you can crush it. There's not an indication that you'd be any worse at doing the job. It's a question of whether you're going to take that and say, hey, this is a better way to do it. And not only is this a better way to do it, but I'm going to make sure my team knows that. And you know what? That's not enough to make sure my team knows it. I'm going to use this as the driver to ensure that the whole company is doing something to create a competitive advantage. And that's sort of the progression across this chart. Some funds want people who are going to execute fundamentally on what they're given without a lot of pushback. And that's important to know as a fund. There are other funds that want people to really be the person that is the impetus behind pushing things forward. And so in private equity, to Rob's point, you really do want people that are at least accelerating what's happening, especially in the CEO seat. If people in that seat tend to be less driven by that, and you have too many people below them who are those driven, transformative leaders, sometimes that can create a problem in the organization as a whole, because there's too much desire for change with people that aren't the eventual decision maker that can make that happen. And that becomes a challenge. So we like to look at, in context of the team, how that plays out. The other piece of it is just ensuring that it's appropriately aligned with the fund and with the role at hand. You want to make sure that you're not having, if you're looking at, an entire management team and you've got your head of HR, which is not designed to be a transformational role within this organization, you want that person to be your steady state. Well, you probably don't want that person to be a driver in this context, because they may be pushing the envelope a little bit too far on things, and especially in a role that's designed to be more staid and protective of the organization. On the flip side, if that's your core challenge of what you're doing, yeah, you do want that person to be your transformative leader. So understanding what the context is for the investment thesis and the organization at hand. The other axis, going from what we call introspective to demonstrative, is a lot about how you react to information in the moment, as well as that speed of decision making. So people who are demonstrative are usually those in a meeting that are the first to respond. They're the people who always have an opinion on things. May not be well reasoned, may not be well researched, could be beautifully researched and reasoned. That's not what this is measuring. It's measuring that speed of reaction, speed of decision making on that front. Being too far to either pole is not necessarily a good thing, because it could indicate that either you're in analysis paralysis on the one end, or that you're purely reactive on the other. But you combine that with some of the other components in here, and it'll give you a lot of insight into whether someone is going to do the work to make sure they know what's happening and then can react quickly, or whether you actually want someone who's going to think it over a little bit, but you know that every time they come to the table, it's going to be exactly the right answer. And knowing that in the context of the larger organization matters too. And so having a sense of, are you an organization that, or a fund that wants someone who's going to have everything at their fingertips and in that meeting come to the conclusions and push forward? Or are you the group that likes to have meetings to discuss the what ifs and then have everyone go back, do the work, and then roll forward from there? And they're different profiles, and neither one's necessarily better. It's just, how does that organization, how does that fund, how does that individual want to work? And putting that together to know, are you going to frustrate those around you, or are you going to frustrate your fund?
Yeah, I see that playing out I also see the benefit of the archetype in helping my clients try to discern a good executive from a good candidate. This is, I don't have any data behind this, but in my experience, generally speaking, the more thoughtful of a person, an individual might be, sometimes the less compelling they are on a first impression basis in an interview, when in fact they may be a dynamite executive for the role, but we're all in a hurry. Private equity has short attention spans. So we found one of the benefits of the archetype is to compel clients to hang in a little longer, maybe schedule a second round, advance a candidate further. And sure enough, like the NCAA bracket, things get reseeded, and you never know who you're going to end up hiring. So last topic on differentiation, then we'll get into how people can kind of take advantage of the Crucible themselves, is this idea of, I guess, in the broad vernacular, machine learning, and how Crucible is understanding itself and constantly evolving to suit best in class results for its executive population that have taken it, combined with the configurability at either the company and or fund level to weight some of the scoring a little bit differently. So a fund, as you pointed out earlier, that is hyper prescriptive may want the execution score to represent 40 or even 50% of an algorithm. Don't quote me on that, but whereas another fund that's a little more hands-off, may want a totally different mix. So just talk through, if you could quickly, the machine learning and configurability aspect of the Crucible.
Yeah, this is one of the benefits of the Crucible thinking of itself as a research tool and being staffed entirely by massive data nerds, is that we were excited about the idea of utilizing machine learning and some of the AI components very early in this process, and structured our data such that that would be a strong prospect. With that, the idea is that as humans, we're good at pattern recognition, but computers are better. And being able to take this massive amount of data, I mean, we're upwards of 3,500 completed crucibles from successful private equity executives.
Yeah, let me
Take that and
just
say,
jump in. I think you've made this distinction, but just so it's super clear to our audience, the population of 3,500 that have taken the Crucible is not across large corporate, nonprofits, government entities, like just about every other assessment that then has a norm that's too generic.
Right.
Your participants are all credible contenders for private equity-backed portfolio company leadership roles.
Correct. And we validated this for that population. And we then went and back tested it to see, okay, is this testing for what we think it is based on exits? And that's something that other assessments just haven't done because they're not so focused on this area. And the way they validated for their own assessments is appropriate for their population pools. Ours is just for private equity, because we want people who want to understand their fit for this world to have the most insight for this specific world. And with that, having machine learning and AI components that can help us better identify, oh, when we see this specific element in emotional leverage higher, that indicates a better fit for this environment, or this, we should rebalance the algorithm, and it's self-rebalancing. We update it once every 6 months to ensure that we're utilizing the best data that's out there from the testing population. So it's not dated, but we're not updating it more often than that to make sure that we're keeping clean and appropriate boundaries on our data. But to make sure that we're having an algorithm that's most appropriate for the population in question, that it's actually showing success. We're also then being able to take that and testing within a given fund their best executives, the people they wish were better, people who had been very successful in companies, people that performed less well than their interview had suggested, and taking that and saying, okay, what are the consistencies between those profiles? And how does that play out for you as a fund. And so then the algorithm can be rebalanced for that fund where, yeah, it might pump it up to a much higher execution score, or there might be certain elements that are pumped up relative to others, but the rest of the general balancing is kept the same. And that's done through the science of it, not through me saying, you know what, this fund seems to be more interested in empathy. Let me make that a higher weighted component within this model.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all fascinating, and I'm sure Crucible itself, is as great as it is not a silver bullet, but it sounds like a much more relevant and tailored level of insight into a behavioral profile for all stakeholders in the private equity world to make better and smarter decisions, whether it be a hiring entity like a sponsor or a portfolio company, on the diligence side before making an acquisition at the fund level, an executive who wants to benchmark themselves and look for ways to tweak their behavior, or an executive team out there that might like to use this instrument to get better insight into how each other operate and where their strengths and blind spots might sit. So maybe just in closing, direct people to where they might find the Crucible and how to get in touch.
Sure. So there are a lot of great assessments out there. I think my takeaway points are that we think we're better for private equity. Use the ones that make sense for your team, that measure what you're trying to measure, and make sure that you're utilizing that to be a better team and a better executive at its core. But if you think that the private equity world is the right place for you and you want to utilize what Crucible has to offer on either the individual or group basis, you can find us at thecrucible.com or through Private Equity CXO. In the shop there's a link to being able to take the Crucible. There are a few offerings where currently we're offering it through that partnership at a bit of a discount to executives, because we respect what's happening on the PECXO side and think it's a great platform for people to get involved with to further their careers in private equity. So
yeah, and I'll just say in closing to our members, you know, we are here to serve you and help ensure your success. The Crucible is aptly named because for those of you in a portfolio company today, you know it is a high temperature environment, and it will either purify your ability to perform or melt you into oblivion. We'd much prefer the former than the latter. And for those of you that want to get a leg up on your job search, whether it's through Falcon or not, I have to tell you, if you show up to an interview and you say to that board of directors, by the way, I'm so serious about understanding my suitability for private equity that I've taken the Crucible. Here are my results. If you'd like to press me on any behavioral questions that you might have, that's going to differentiate you and also maybe help you look in the mirror and better understand where you belong. So,
yeah.
Lindsay, thanks again. This has been great. We've demystified it a little bit. We've given people some avenues for understanding and then some action items if they want to get a better handle on their businesses or themselves. So thank you and best of luck out there.
Well, really appreciate it as always. And thanks for the opportunity to come on and chat a little bit about assessments.
Yeah, we'll do it again. Thanks, Lindsay.
Perfect. Take care.